Hello and thank you for stopping by. My name is Becky and this is BecxReadz, and today I am bringing you a weekly wrap up. So this is something that I fully intend to do throughout the year. I never mentioned it because I didn't know if I'd be able to follow through. I'm not sure just how regularly this is going to happen, but I'm gonna try to do weekly wrap-ups and then just do like a summary of my monthly wrap-ups at the end of the month, because I realized that I love a lot of books, but I don't like talking about all of them in depth at the end of the month because sometimes I've forgotten what the details were, and those videos get so extensively long and I hate editing them. So I want to talk about the books that I'm reading and loving while they're fresh in my mind. This is what I have read from January 1st to January 6th. And I managed to finish 4 books in this first week of January, which I am pretty proud of. The first book I finished was an audio for The Witch and the Czar. This is my Black Hat Book Coven's book pick for January. So if you are interested in reading this, by all means, read it and come discuss it with us at the end of the month on Jackie's channel. We will be having a live show discussion on, I think, January 27th. Here's the information. But we will also be doing reading sprints on the 14th on my channel. So come and read this with us. Since I have already finished it, I will not be reading it during those live sprints, but it was a library loan and I needed to get it read before my loan expired. This is a historical fiction about a young Baba Yaga who is just living her quiet life in the forest trying to help people when her friend Anastasia comes and asks her for help. And when she does this, this kicks off a series of events in which she has to risk everything to try and save the people of Russia from Ivan the Terrible and these dark gods who are encouraging and feeding the darkness within men and creating wars. This is my second time reading this book. I tried to read it last year and I DNF'd it about 2 hours into the audiobook. So when I re-requested it from my library, it picked up right where I had DNF'd it the first time. And I didn't particularly feel like going back and listening to it from the beginning. But because it was Jackie's pick for our book club, I figured, you know what, I will give it a second try and I will push myself to finish out this book. And it wasn't very much more enjoyable the second time, let me tell you. I was still bored for a big majority of this book. I'm not going to go into all of my thoughts and feelings on it because I do want to save something for the live show discussion, but it took me about 65% into this book before something finally clicked and it started to grab my attention enough to the point where I started to somewhat enjoy it more. That's my thoughts on this book, the first book of January. Didn't start off great, but I did finish it and I will be able to discuss it on that live show. I then listened to the audio of Assistant to the Villain, which is a pretty popular book as of late. I wasn't sure if I wanted to buy this book because I've heard mixed things about it and I was like, yeah, you know, if I don't like it, I don't want to spend all that money for a physical copy if I'm not going to enjoy it. So luckily, again, this was another library loan. So look at me starting the year off with the library loans. This is the story of Evie and Tristan, who is the villain. Evie is supporting her ailing father and her younger sister after a tragic event led to her mother and her brother's passing, and a chance encounter with the local villain leads to her landing the job as his assistant. And she really doesn't mind this job. It has its drawbacks, you know, there are like severed heads hanging from the ceiling and he's always killing people, but it comes with, you know, benefits and perks, and a girl's gotta do what a girl's gotta do, you know? A job is a job. And one of the biggest perks of her job is that she is insanely attracted to her boss, the villain. And he is attracted to her as well, but when he is around her, he's acting out of character. He's feeling things he shouldn't be feeling as a villain. And meanwhile, there is a rat within the villainous company, and somebody is trying to take down his operation. So Evie is in charge of like going through every single employee and trying to weed out who could be the rat within the company and who isn't. This audiobook isn't my favorite audiobook. The way that it's narrated, there are some really weird pauses within the sentence. However, I upped it to 2.8 speed, and so it cut that out a little bit. It's also only singularly narrated, which I didn't love. I would prefer if this book had been dual cast narrated so that I could get a sense of the villain's own voice, because I really didn't feel like the narration of it did much either. Like, the narrator didn't like inflict their voice for different characters or anything like that. I loved this like sweet, innocent crush that Tristan and Evie have for each other. I thought it played out really well. It was a very slow burn progression. I wouldn't actually say this is a romance though, because there's really no romance within the story. It's almost like that puppy love where you're attracted to somebody, but you don't really act on that attraction. I think they have one kiss within this entire story, which I didn't mind. I didn't need there to be a lot of spice. In fact, I was pretty surprised that there wasn't any spice, because I thought there would be in this book. So that was a nice surprise, but I really don't feel like it's a romance in my opinion. I also really liked the side characters of this. One of the characters' names is actually Becky. So when it came up and she's like this very rule following, almost a bitchy person, I laughed. I'm like, great, I finally get a character who's named Becky, and this is her. But I sort of felt for her, and I would like to see her get her own story and find her happily ever after, because I feel like she has a backstory that may make me more sympathetic to her as a character. I also liked the villain's little frog sidekick. I think it's somebody that he put a curse on to be a frog, and the way this frog communicates, he just holds up like one-word signs to communicate with people, and it was incredibly ridiculous and cute. I wouldn't say this has a very standout plot. It's pretty character focused, which again is something I don't mind, but I thought I would mention it. One thing that really bothered me within this story though is the fact that even once we learn the villain's name, his name is Tristan, this book continued to call him the villain. Even in his point of view, it was the villain's point of view. It's like, I know his name is Tristan. Why don't you just tell me Tristan's point of view? And even after Evie discovers his real name, she still continues to call him the villain. And I'm like, why though? Why is that necessary? It's not. Also, for him being the villain, he is one of the least villainous characters I have ever read in my life. He is like villain light, like diet villain. And it's a lot of telling us he's villainous instead of showing us he's villainous. Overall, I did enjoy this story. I don't think I enjoyed it enough to own a physical copy of it, so I'm glad that I did go the route of listening to the audiobook before deciding to make that purchase. But I am still interested enough to see where the sequel goes, because it did end on a cliffhanger. And the other two books that I finished this week were actually a duology, and I am so proud of myself because it was one of the duologies that I had mentioned in my series that I need to finish video from last year, which I will link down below if you want to watch that. But I had read the first book back in 2012. And at the time, the sequel hadn't been put out, and so when the sequel was released, I still hadn't read it. So I had to go back and I had to reread Unicorn Bait, which I hadn't read since 2012. So I had forgotten a lot about this story. I had completely forgotten like the overall plot of the story and how it ended. All I really remembered was the unicorn aspect of it. So this is a very ridiculous fantasy romance, let me tell you. We follow this woman named Naomi who is going through her dead grandfather's things one day when she finds this unicorn horn, and she doesn't think it's real. She thinks it's just a knickknack or whatever, but she is like cleaning it and she pricks her finger at the end of it, and it transports her to this fantasy land. There's absolutely no world building in this fantasy land at all. You are just dropped right into this fantasy land where there is a war going on. This guy, he is taking over the territories, and when Naomi is dropped into this fantasy land, people think that she is this Lady Naomi. And she's like, I don't know who this Lady Naomi is. My name is Naomi, but I'm not from here. You've got the wrong girl. But this witch takes her, and she takes her to the castle, and she dresses her all up and whatnot. And she pretty much puts her in the position to be captured by this warlord and forced to be his bride. So this warlord Tavik brands her, forces her to be his wife, and then he takes her back to his castle in a different part of the country. She is making sarcastic comments about this entire fantasy world and how she must be delusional. Maybe she hit her head. Maybe she's in a coma and she's dreaming this, because none of this could be real. Because she's dropped into this fantasy land where she's forced to marry this warlord, and on top of that, she can't even see this warlord's face. She has no idea what he looks like because he wears a knight in shining armor's helm. He's trying to put her at ease and trying to make her comfortable because he's not a terrible guy. So when they're having dinner together, he will tie her hands up and he will blindfold her and he will feed her and try and get to know her. And she's trying to figure out things about her new husband without seeing him. Like, she knows he's bald because he does take off his helm, and he tries to kiss her a couple times, and she realizes, hey, he's a pretty good kisser. She's growing to like him, but she wants to get back to her own reality, and she knows that in order to do this, she has to track down a unicorn and use the unicorn horn to do this. And so they go on this journey through these enchanted forests and through this country to try and track down these very elusive unicorn to try and help her get back to her own reality. And in doing so, she and her husband eventually grow closer. She eventually sees him without his mask on, and it goes on from there. I had such a great time rereading this book because it was like reading it for the first time. I thought the characters were incredibly quirky. I liked that Naomi was questioning things and like wondering if she was like... I liked the family dynamics because you do find out there are some interesting dynamics between her husband and other people within this territory. I thought it had a pretty decent plot for how ridiculous it was. I liked the journey through this fantasy land and all the things that she had to do to try and attract this unicorn. Sometimes it didn't make quite sense, but I just rolled with it because I liked the character chemistry. I liked the like captor-captive forced marriage aspect to it. This book has absolutely no spice in it at all. Her husband is actually a virgin, and so he agrees to not do anything sexual with her in exchange for her not trying to look at him without his mask on. And the dynamic of him being a virgin, but yet he's attracted to her, and he tries to steal kisses from her, and she's like attracted to him, but she doesn't know that he's a virgin for the longest time, but she needs a virgin to attract a unicorn. And it's just a ridiculous fun time with a decent plot that I really enjoyed. And then once I was done with that, I completed this duology finally after 12 years. I read Dragon's Prey, which picks up about 4 to 5 months after the end of Unicorn Bait. And Naomi and Tavik are supposedly living this great life. They are married now, but he wants a child and she is not ready to have a child. And so every time her period comes, she's ecstatic about it. She's like, oh, thank God I'm not pregnant yet. And meanwhile, he's like, oh, shoot, you're not pregnant yet. And she doesn't really communicate with him the best. I wish that would have been something that they had done earlier in the book, is communicate that she's just not ready to have a kid yet. She would like to have a family eventually, but she's just not ready for it yet. And she feels all this pressure from these people to have a baby. And while she's dealing with that, the Lady Naomi that she was mistaken for from the first book shows up and puts a love spell or a love curse on Tavik so that he stops loving his wife Naomi and he falls in love with the real Lady Naomi. And she's like, you have everything that should have been mine. And so now her husband wants to kill her so that he can rightfully marry the real Lady Naomi. Meanwhile, Naomi is like, have you people never heard of divorce? And he's like, what's that? So she goes on this journey once again to try and find this elusive flower to get him out of this curse and this spell. I think it's not a forget-me-not. What's it called in this fantasy world? I can't remember what it's called in this fantasy world, but it's pretty similar to a forget-me-not. Along the way, she ends up picking up one of these dangerous kangaroo creatures who she names Hip Hop. she ends up befriending one of the unicorns and names it Snowflake. But then she ends up capturing the attention of this green dragon who puts this mark on her as his prey. And so he is intent on killing her. So she has to try and figure out a way to save herself from being dragon prey, all while trying to find this flower to cure her husband of this curse. And it's just this ridiculous mess of a plot of a story that I had the best time with. Now, I did feel at times that it could have been condensed because there was just one thing after another that got in her way of completing this task to save her husband. And then on top of that, we have her husband who is just like, we don't love each other. I never loved you. And it's really messing with her emotions because she is still so much in love with her husband, but hearing him constantly say, I never loved you, you never loved me, we weren't meant to be together, she's constantly like, maybe we aren't meant to be together. Maybe I should just find a way back to my reality. She's having trouble finding this flower to cure her husband's curse. And so she's like, maybe you just need to go and you need to live a happy life with this lady Naomi. She will give you the baby that you want. You two can live happily ever after. But she's also warring with, but I still love this guy so fucking much. And we love each other. We gave up so much for each other. I loved it. I loved it so fucking much. It's so ridiculous, but it was such a great time. It's not perfect by any means. And for a backlist fantasy romance with such low spice, I thoroughly enjoyed it. Second book did have a little bit more spice. There was an actual smut scene in it, very brief. But I think if you love fantasy romance and you want something a little quirky, a little ridiculous, a little fun and lighthearted with low spice, you should definitely check out this duology because I would still recommend it to this day. Those were the 4 books that I managed to complete this first week of January. I enjoyed 3 of the 4 of them. I'm not going to share like my star ratings or anything like that. You will have to wait till the end of the month to see my wrap up and see what I gave them. But yeah, it wasn't too bad of a first week, let me tell you. So let me know down in the comments, have you read any of these books? Have I convinced you to read A Unicorn Bait and A Dragon Prey? But if you don't want to comment that but would like to let me know that you made it to the end of this video, could you leave me a frog emoji? So with that, thank you so much for watching, and until my next video, go read an audiobook. Bye.